an eye on the chat for me, but we can just go ahead and get going. And the very first thing we're going to show you is the cuteness. So this is a video of some baby beavers just hanging out. This was in August of 2019. And the full video is on YouTube, but we can just enjoy the exhausted mother and the adorable baby. And we're about to say in the next slide that we wanted to give thanks to Steve Berliner, who has taken a lot of the really wonderful wildlife photographs that we have. And also this video footage is courtesy of him as well. So we're gonna get to look at some pretty cute animals, but we just thought we'd hit you right off the bat with the little babies. All right. So now to really get us foundationally started, we wanted to start with a thank you to our partners and funders. So that's Oak Lodge Water Services, Clackamas West Water Environment Services, and the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District. We work with all of these partners with really similar goals in mind and are grateful that they've helped make these workshops possible. You're probably familiar with the housekeeping slide then too, since a lot of you have been in these workshops before. So generally the protocol is to keep yourselves on mute, but keep your finger near the button because we're going to be having a little bit of what animal do you think this is questions, and we'll see if we can get some guesses from you all. But yeah, most of you are on mute already, so we're off to a good start there. Feel free to ask questions either over audio or in chat. Neil will kind of keep an eye on the chat, and if it's something like just circling back a slide, I'll be able to do that pretty quickly. And again, there's the little thumbnails that probably are covering part of the screen that you can adjust fairly easily. So tonight we are going to talk about the wildlife in the North Clackamas Watershed. So we're going to have a bit of a deeper dive into some of the main, more iconic species that are also more impactful and have a bit of a ripple effect throughout the watershed's ecosystem and wildlife. And then, we'll talk a little bit about what we do and how do we make this whole urban, suburban wildlife habitat work, right? There's more wildlife here often than people are expecting there is, but it's not always easy for that wildlife to thrive. And so we will be talking a little bit about some of the challenges that wildlife here face and some of the ways that we can help them as individuals and in working together. All right. So speaking of what animal is this? No wrong answers, but what animal is this? Any guesses?
Beaver.
You got it.
Is it a nutria?
It's not a nutria. A good way to tell beaver and nutria apart in just one photo is nutria have much more visible white whiskers on their face.
Oh.
So if you're seeing a cute rodent face without super visible white whiskers, most likely a beaver there. Oops. What about this one?
Great blue heron.
Yep, great blue heron, you got it. With the cool funky hairdo, not the only bird with a neat hairdo we have in here. What about this?
Buick's wren.
You got it, Buick's wren. So I am also, like Barbara, not a birder. I have the behind the scenes photo captions that have helped me through some of the bird bits here. What about here?
Coyotes.
Yep, we have some coyote pups. These were born in August last year. We couldn't only show the little cute birds.
Red-tailed.
Cooper's
Yeah, we're not, yep, I would need to double check just to make sure, but we're pretty sure this one's a red-tailed hawk. So we wanted to orient you to the wildlife in our watershed in this presentation. And so the wildlife here are living in, throughout the entire watershed, and we'll show that on a map in just a moment. But we're not only talking about the creek system, right, with being a watersheds council, we look at the creeks really closely, but we're also paying attention to the habitat throughout the terrestrial spaces. And so this map shows the North Clackamas watersheds. The green area is the watersheds that we serve. And so the tan areas are the cities that interact with our watersheds and overlap. And basically what this green blob means is that the creek systems here are collecting water from everywhere in that green space. That water is going to flow to the creeks and eventually straight into the Willamette River. So we have, Kellogg out towards the eastern portion. Mount Scott is coming up from Happy Valley, coming off of Scatterers Mountain and Mount Talbert. And then the river forest, Boardman and Rynierson Creeks go directly straight into the Willamette itself. So the numbered places on here, and you can see on the key, these places are sort of the big, more anchor habitats. Kellogg Lake is called out. That habitat is right now mostly for, ducks and carp, but should really be serving a much bigger function ecologically. And so we'll talk a little bit about the action items that are happening around Kellogg Dam and Kellogg Lake. The Three Creeks Natural Area shares a parking lot with the Harmony campus of Clackamas Community College and the Aquatic Center, and is sort of, a big natural area with some Douglas fir going on. We have more forested areas up in Mount Scott Creek. And again, places like Boardman, Rynierson, Meldrum Bar, Boardman Wetlands specifically are, again, more deeply and directly connected just to the Willamette itself. So it's neat to start looking at the maps right off the bat and kind of tagging out some of the main anchor habitats, because we'll be talking also about wildlife or about habitat connectivity and how our wildlife are able to move from place to place and exist in those places in between much more than we might think they're able to. So again, just to kind of introduce us and make the case for the wildlife that we have here, of all the animals, of all the living things in the world, what is the animal that changes the physical environment the most? Any guesses? I'll give you a hint. It's probably the only animal sitting on Zoom right now.
Yeah, it's pretty
That would be
obvious.
us humans, right? But the second most impactful are actually beaver. So beaver are ecosystem engineers. They really create a lot of important habitat. So we'll be talking about them and the impressive impacts that they can have. Another thing that's really awesome to think about for wildlife and our ecosystems is that about a third of the nitrogen in forests comes from salmon. You can do environmental DNA, eDNA tracing, and folks have been able to track that the nitrogen in trees is oceanic in origin, basically, so that as the salmon have come upstream and spawned, then been carried into the forest further by whatever might have eaten them, we see that salmon can really provide a lot of important nutrients because nitrogen is a limiting factor for our forests. If you want them to grow, you'll need some decomposition, and that's a pretty important source.
West side forests? What are east side forests?
I think this is, I think west side means west of the Cascades.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And one of my favorite tidbits is I did not know growing up that insects migrate and dragonflies migrate. And 3 out of the 5 of North America's major annual migratory dragonfly species, there's only really 3 in this part of the US, and all 3 of those are found in the North Clackamas watersheds. And when we say migration, we're talking about from Honduras to British Columbia. That can be the full extent of the range that those dragonflies are taking. And so that is an example of a really large sort of aerial and terrestrial combination of habitat connectivity that North Clackamas watersheds right here in the, in the urban area is a part of. So we're gonna have a little bit more of what animals are here. Anyone?
Is that a barred owl or a spotted owl?
Or great horn.
Yeah, great horned owl. Last time Neil said that he would bet money that you are within 100 yards of a great horned owl right now. So it's cool to, one of the things that we're sort of unpeeling is the ways that wildlife are a little bit more ubiquitous and around throughout the watershed right here in our neighborhoods. What about this? Anyone with fish ID? We talked about birds.
What kind of salmon is it?
Yeah, this is a coho salmon.
I was thinking it was coho, but
Yeah,
pretty.
you were right. Yeah, their spawning colors are pretty out of this world. What about this one? Don't think of it as, don't think too hard. It isn't a trick question. We've seen this one already. This is the beaver.
Leave it to beaver.
Leave it to beaver. Again, we wanted to show you the coyote pups. How about left to right on here? Oops, on here.
Palliated woodpecker? Is that
This
right?
It's a woodpecker.
It's a sapsucker.
Yep, this is a red-breasted sapsucker.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so these are the ones that, you know, like woodpeckers, drilling holes in our trees so that the bugs get stuck in the sap and they'll come back and eat those bugs later.
A kestrel.
Yep, American
Cool.
kestrel, smallest falcon in North America. As you can see right here.
Kingfisher.
Kingfisher.
You're running through it, totally. And right here on the right.
I'm not sure what kind of, that's not a rufous, is it?
Nope.
Hummingbird.
It is a hummingbird. This is the Anna's hummingbird. So these are
Anna.
the more common, slightly more adaptable ones that we're more likely to be seeing year round.
Wow.
All right. So when we said thank you, Steve, for the photos, thank you, Steve, for these photos. All right. We've already gone over some of the bigger megafauna. Let's do clockwise from top left.
Is it a pond turtle?
Close. That's one of the two native turtles of concern. This one's the western painted turtle.
Hmm.
What about this guy in the upper right?
Is that a skink?
It is, yeah, this is a western skink. One of these has been documented on iNaturalist just at Elk Rock Island, which is right in the watersheds here.
Mm-hmm.
What about, let's do lower left.
It's a dragonfly, but I have no idea what kind.
It is, yeah, bonus points if you can ID the kind. The thing that's making ID for this one extra tricky is that bluish, whitish coating that it has. It's the same kind of coating that you'll see on like plums. It's called pruinosity, and it's something that dragonflies develop further throughout the season. So a couple weeks before this photo was taken, I think this one's a common green darner. It would have been much more easily distinguishable by some brighter colors that have since gotten a little bit covered up. What about lower right?
Is that a
Was it-
viceroy?
What was that?
Is that a viceroy?
Viceroy.
Viceroy butterfly?
So this
A
is
tiger swallowtail.
Yeah,
There you
swallowtail.
go. Okay.
Yeah, so to tell butterflies versus moths, you can just take a look at their antenna. Our butterflies are going to have long, kind of more straight antenna, whereas moths have the fuzziness coming out of their antenna. And for dragonflies versus damselflies, our damselflies are going to have much thinner, smaller bodies. And their eyes are actually, with our dragonfly here, you can see their eyes are so large they're touching. But for damselflies, their eyes are going to be on the side of their heads, a little bit more outwards facing. All right.
Doesn't the
And-
damselfly have the wings behind it also?
Yeah, the damselflies will perch with their wings alongside their body, and the dragonfly has their wings spread outward when they perch. Yeah, this video, it disappeared and I just didn't have quite the time to bring it back up. But if you look really faintly, this is a raccoon pulling a pretty big fish out of the creek. This was a piece of video footage that was captured by one of our Streamside Stewards program participants, who has a wildlife camera set up along the creek in her yard, and she got this really great little video clip of a couple of raccoons pulling a pretty big fish out of the creek there. So one thing that's neat about urban wildlife is with the availability of, more affordable wildlife cameras and so on, we can sort of spy on them a little bit more and start to learn more about their movement patterns in urban areas. And movement patterns are Movement patterns are really kind of what it's about for wildlife. Our wildlife here need to be able to access their habitat, and the four sort of key things here are food, water, shelter, and sex, right? And they need all four of those, and those specific needs might vary also throughout space and time and the different life stages that we're talking about for our wildlife. Movement patterns in urban areas can be pretty complicated. And so if we're thinking about that earlier image that showed those larger anchor habitat sites in the watersheds, like Three Creeks Natural Area and so on, we can think of those as maybe more of the patches. And we know that our wildlife need to be able to travel from habitat patch to habitat patch. And they can do that in a couple of different ways. And sometimes that corridor will be a nice contiguous stretch of habitat that they can move through well. And sometimes they'll need more of a bit of a stepping stone approach. We'll be talking, we'll be talking more about habitat connectivity and how it factors in for our wildlife as we move through the presentation tonight. We wanted to show you all the fish specifically. As a watershed council, a lot of our work is driven by fish and their needs. So can anyone recognize what kind of salmon this is? What kind of salmonid this is?
Edda.
Is that a steelhead? Not
This
sure.
one's a coho as well.
That's a coho.
Yep. And this is, last time we had a bunch of fish debate, but that's okay if we have less fish people in here tonight. So this is a female Chinook.
Wow.
What about this one?
Rainbow.
Is it trout?
Rainbow.
So this, yeah, so we'll start getting into some cool fish facts. So steelhead, which is what we see here, are basically an anadromous version of rainbow trout. So anadromous meaning born in freshwater, moves out to the ocean, comes back to spawn in freshwater and makes that journey. There's no genetic difference between steelhead and rainbow trout. It's just a behavior thing. And one thing that's really interesting with steelhead is all salmon die after spawning immediately, but steelhead can actually spawn multiple times and repeat that journey a few times over. All right, what about this? So here we have cutthroat trout. And in the North Clackamas Watershed system, there are some resident cutthroat trout that we have moving throughout our system. All right, branching out from salmonids just a little bit.
Haha.
Mhm.
Eel.
No idea.
No idea. Kat, did you say you had an idea?
Is that a lamprey?
Yeah, so this is a Pacific lamprey. And you'll hear them referred to casually as eels, but they're not. They're actually a jawless prehistoric fish. If we could see the underside of their mouth right now, they have a really fascinating sort of circular radial teeth arrangement that sort of looks like the Kraken if you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean, just this kind of rows and rows of little teeth. And we're bringing Pacific lamprey into the conversation more, in large part because they've sort of been regarded in recent years as, in the past several decades or hundred of years or so, as sort of a trash fish or a fish that isn't as interesting. And in part, that's because they're a little difficult to study. They tend to be nocturnal. They tend to spend some time burrowed down in the sediment, but they are actually a first food for native people here and are really fascinating. This upper green shaded area shows how long dinosaurs were around. You can see that salmon appeared about 6 million years ago, which is just a blink of the eye in terms of fossil records, whereas lamprey have been around for 450 million years. So when we say prehistoric, we mean prehistoric. They're really awesome, ancient, really interesting animals. And they used to be a lot more abundant than they are. This photo is taken at, as you can see, in Willamette Falls, which to this day is actually just about one of the only places where folks are able to harvest where native folks are able to harvest specific lamprey. They are very fun. If you know that salmon build their redds or their nests to lay their eggs in by using their tails to kind of make a dent in the gravel, lamprey have to pick up one rock at a time and wiggle it over and drop it somewhere else. So lamprey have to work really hard and climb waterfalls with their face in order to get through their life cycle. And they are also anadromous like salmon are, but whereas salmon have that homing skill and will return to the system that they were born in, lamprey will go wherever is available. But again, we're still really learning a lot about lamprey and how to make fish passage projects work for lamprey too. They can't clear that 90-degree jump that fish ladders have. So the reason why we focus on salmon are, the reasons are listed here. So their populations have declined quite a lot. We're just at about 5% of historical salmon populations. And similar to lamprey, they're really culturally significant for Native Americans here. And as mentioned, also they're a keystone species as far as just nutrients in forests. And they're a big part of our economy. They had back in 2013, they had, $1.5 billion in Oregon's economic impact and about 7,200 jobs, and it's probably more in 2021 dollars now. And when we're thinking about habitat, if you have a kid or if you've ever been a kid, you'll know that kids are different from adults and teenagers are different from kids and adults, right? So when we're talking about habitat during different life stages or stages of a life cycle, we want to bring life cycle into the conversation here because the salmon that we see in the North Clackamas watersheds are more likely to be those little ones on the left-hand screen that we hope will grow up to be the one on the right-hand side. And that one on the right-hand side here was a coho taken in Upper Mount Scott Creek in our watersheds because they can only sometimes get up through the system. And starting to think about fish in urban areas, this was a really interesting piece of science that just came out in December. For a really long time, there have been these mass die-offs of coho in urban streams. And it took researchers quite a while, and it was a really interesting process, and they were finally able to isolate.
Thank you.
You're there.
Thank you so much, Sue.
Well, Monday she's recording it, so you can go back and watch.
Neil, I think you might be able to forcibly, unfortunately, put them on mute. They were able to isolate what was killing the coho in those urban streams, and it's something called 6-ppd quinone, I believe. I'm not sure about the pronunciation there, but it's basically a preservative in car tires. And so something's been killing these urban coho. And it turns out it's this preservative that leaches pretty slowly where the coho end up, getting disoriented and swimming in circles and having trouble breathing and eventually just die. It seems to affect coho more directly than Chinook. But this is just sort of a quick demonstration of the roles, of the role that chemicals have that roll right off our roads and into our habitats. And what are we going to do about this? Are we just going to take our tires off of our cars and drive around on our rims? Like, that's an impractical solution, but that doesn't mean that a solution is impractical. It just means that these kinds of things will need to take a while. We've done things like remove asbestos and lead from our lived environment as much as possible. And so it'll be complicated to solve. But one thing we can do is to start to better manage the water that's coming off of our roads in our urban watersheds. So this is what a watershed or a kind of cross section of a creek might look like in a less urbanized area. As you can see, we've got a lot closer to an old growth forest going on here. We have some wood in the stream. There's a bunch of complexity here. There's these deep pools for hiding, and you can see small fish and large fish are in there. There's shade clearly that's keeping that water nice and cool, and collecting gravel and cobblestones. Not a lot here in the way of culverts and passage barriers for our fish. There are log jams, absolutely, but our fish have evolved with those, and they play an important part in the watershed, and can get through those log jams. So our urban watersheds might look a little bit more like this. This photo, I believe, is in Kellogg Creek. Neil, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. This is a photo taken from the bioassessment that the Watersheds Council moved forward last year. So what we see here is a creek system that's, comparatively a lot more simplified. We don't see a lot of in-stream wood adding those like deep pools and pockets and collecting that gravel, right? Instead, we're asking questions like, well, what is the substrate? What am I walking on? What is the bottom of the stream made of? Are there places for, young fish to hide in here? You can see lawns and you can see some pavement going right up to the creek. So we might have less in the way of shade and habitat diversity, less wood being contributed to the stream, and even things, running right off, possibly from our driveway right into the creek. So when we're looking at our urban watersheds, we did this assessment in order to get an idea for what projects can and should be done in the watersheds to improve habitat. And so here, we ranked pools and identified areas where we would like to add woody debris and add more shelter for wildlife. So these are some of the components that scientists are looking at when we're trying to say, how can we improve our urban creek systems for our wildlife, particularly with fish in mind here. So again, when we're talking about fish in the North Clackamas watersheds, with the Kellogg and Mount Scott and Rainerson River Forest and Boardman, most of that habitat is not for spawning. A little bit in Upper Mount Scott and Boardman, but the core role that the North Clackamas watersheds play for salmon is off-channel rearing and basically upstream and downstream migration habitat, a sort of pause point for them. And so most of the fish that we see are going to be about this size. They're not the big spawners, they're just little guys. And we'll circle back a little bit more to this sort of the role as far as when I say upstream and downstream migration. We'll circle back to that sort of rearing and habitat role when we return to connectivity. But for now, I wanted to walk you a little bit more through beaver again. So another cross section of beavers habitat. In this photo right here, the lodge that the beavers have built are more in the middle of the pond that they created. In urban areas, beavers can also tunnel into the sides of the banks for their lodges. The beaver are sort of the rock stars of our charismatic megafauna. Beavers are, like I said, ecosystem engineers. They really can massively impact the hydrology of our watersheds and what's growing where and where water is stored. They help with stormwater filtration, with creating floodplain, which is really important, for salmon habitat. And we do, get calls about, a beaver is blocking a culvert near me or something like that. And when those kinds of things happen, the problem isn't the beaver, it's just that it's the culvert, right? It might be too small. And if you clear the culvert, you might, get a temporary removal of beavers, but they're going to come back tomorrow. They're inclined to respond to the sound of running water. I want to plug that right up. And so when people experience flooding in their houses, it's going to be more likely because that house is built in the floodplain or in the area that historically would be flooded seasonally, and provide a place for the rivers to spill out of their banks a little bit and soak in. So we want to think a little bit, about how we live with beaver because they provide a ton of benefits and they're adorable. And with that, we will show you some baby beavers first time swimming. I'll let you read the captions here. So yeah, once again, this is on Boardman Creek. A group of beavers is called a colony that they live in family groups usually. So just like humans, when the babies grow up, they move away a little bit and try to establish themselves, set up shop somewhere not too far from where they grew up, but to set up their own territory. Like I said, they're drawn to the sound of running water. And let's see, we can see one little dude go through. So yeah, once again, the only thing with beaver is that they don't follow the permitting process for building in the floodplain. So we're here to talk a little bit about building that appreciation for our beavers. All right. So here we can see how beaver can, sort of change a habitat. We have a dam, which creates a pool of water behind it, and that creates a lot of different benefits. And I've been asked before, don't beaver dams, we know that human-made dams are bad for fish passage, right? It makes it difficult for them to move through. And so don't beaver dams block fish passage? Isn't that a not good thing? But the timing of when water is high enough to provide salmon space to move past those dams means that it doesn't provide a conflict. And actually, one of the really neat things that beaver pools provide is the water trickles through slowly in the lower areas underwater. And if you've ever jumped into a pool or into a lake and swum down towards the bottom, you know that it's a little colder down there, right? So beaver dams can actually help to lower the temperature of the creek. And their dams also provide filtration. They do a really efficient job of improving water quality. And so this data is actually all from one stormwater facility that cost millions of dollars to build, right? So they spent millions of dollars building a facility and it was doing okay. Then beavers came. It was doing okay in removing some pollutants, which is what we want our stormwater facilities to do. All that runoff from our creeks or from our roads, our stormwater facilities will help to filter that out for us. So it was doing an okay job of removing the pollutants. And then beaver moved in. And last time we gave this workshop, the scientist behind this paper was actually tuning in to join us. And so she said, then beaver came and everyone, and they changed everything and people freaked out. We said, well, let's go ahead and collect some data here. And it turned out that with beaver dams, the beavers are actually cleaning the water even better than the millions of dollars of stormwater facilities. So the beaver got to stay. And again, the water was also coming out colder than it was going in. And, as we were reminded last week by John, temperature is a pollutant as well. We don't often think of it in the list of chemical pollutants, but in urban areas, temperature is a really important thing. And so the fact that they can also cool down our water is really critical for our urban watersheds. When we say that they're ecosystem engineers or keystone species particularly, what we mean is that they don't only create habitat for themselves or even for salmon, they create habitat for a lot of critters. So here we have a muskrat coming through. These are all just within a week or so of each other, all of this video footage. And then after the muskrat, we have some mink. So the dam is clearly a magnet for different wildlife species, right? And then we have a coyote come through. Again, all of this is on Steve's YouTube channel, so I'll kind of try to click us through here. We have some raccoons smiling for the camera for us. And then the beaver itself. And Neil, I forgot to set the recording. Did you do that? It looks like you did. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, so this was at Bourbon Creek in Jennings Lodge. So again, like we said, this dam is a magnet. It changes the water flow, it cools the water. The logs that they're using will end up decomposing. And attract bugs and so on and so forth. And so beaver can really help to move in more critters.
Does their feces provide nutrients or?
I in the same way that most does, I think so. That's a good
I would
question. I
think
don't know if
so.
there's
I just didn't know if it got kind of toxic with it, or if the stream would maybe flow enough that it wouldn't be, you know, too
yeah,
germy.
I'm inclined to think that the latter part of your statement is what's true.
They also
Really,
use before they recycle. They tend to eat their own poop, just like dogs do sometimes.
extra recyclers. Good to know. Yeah, no, really when we're worried about, the impacts of poop in our watersheds, it's because of the concentration of human presence and humans pets. And that's just more than what, our ecosystems are a little bit more balanced for already.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've got
So, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, now we have a fun fact.
Yeah, we do. I'll have to have you say that one again, Neil, just so I made sure I caught it all at the end of this. um, so, beavers are a supplement to a lot of the work that we do. They're able to, in many cases, to do it, better and cheaper and faster. So, when we shared this, we had some engineers with us, and they took no offense at us saying, "Why hire an engineer if rodents can do the job for free?" Right? And there's a lot of really cool, a lot of neat work going on right now in the environmental community of really thinking about beaver more as an eco partner and working with beaver in restoration. A lot of restoration work involves planting trees right along the side of the creek. And well, if there's trees growing along the side of an urban creek, beaver are going to find it and want to eat it. And so Kate Hollern at Metro has done a lot of really cool stuff for advocating for working with beaver so that we can invite them and still implement our restoration work and overplant to keep it balanced because of all of the great benefits that beavers do provide. All right, the next of the charismatic megafauna that we wanted to just show again were just all of these adorable coyote pup pictures. In the realm of urban wildlife and urban wildlife research and studies, the University of Chicago did a bunch of neat stuff around coyotes. And Neil, I'm not sure if the paper that you were referencing when you were discussing this last time was Dr. Christopher Schell, who's now at the University of Washington, but he's also done a bunch of great stuff around urban habitat. And the really interesting thing with coyotes is they tagged the coyotes and tracked them moving all through downtown Chicago, on a daily basis, often at nighttime or in places where they were a little bit out of sight. And in urban areas, they're opportunistic omnivores, but they're still eating they're eating, rats and squirrels and so still kind of eating their normal food. But in these urban areas, they were also living longer and growing faster than they were in wild areas, avoiding cars and people, but not necessarily having to deal with wolves or maybe ranchers that are protective of livestock and things like that. And so in a way they're you could depending on how fond you are of squirrels and stuff, you could say that they're a low-key pest control, and also think of them sort of as like an urban apex predator. And same thing like what Neil said about the great horned owl. They're around you and you just don't know it right now. So, and another interesting part of the Chicago study was, just the little patches in urban areas, like a tree in your parking strip or in the right of way, right? When a squirrel can't move from one spot to another fast enough and the coyote snags it while we're inside attending an online workshop and we just aren't looking. That little right of way strip right outside our houses, that is habitat. So it's not just those big patches, it still is absolutely our neighborhoods. And so even the suburban street tree type of, ecosystem bits that we have around here are all really connected. And that's the really beautiful thing about watersheds, is that we can look at everything that happens in the watersheds. I just addressed all of that. Cool. So this is a screech owl that ended up in Neil's friend Eleanor's house, and it was there for a couple of days. And these are the kinds of things, it probably hit its head running, flying into a window. And this sort of segues us into what are the things that we need to sort of manage so that we can have a peaceful coexistence with our urban wildlife. And to do that, we need to look a little bit at what urbanization has done to our ecosystems, right? Cities have certainly not always been here. If you know Portland's nickname of Stump Town, because so many stumps were cut down, that those were the natural stepping stones when it was so wet and muddy in the winter, right? We've removed a lot of vegetation, which has removed a lot of habitat for our wildlife here. And so by removing this vegetation and creating a city, or just suburban sprawl even, we've removed habitat. And so that's limiting those moving patterns from a connectivity perspective. And now in streams specifically, we've done a lot of that simplification and channelization that we saw when it was those photos of Kellogg Creek and asking questions about in-stream wood and shade and so on. So this photo is from Johnson Creek, which is just the watershed directly north of North Clackamas's. And during the Great Depression, and in response to the Great Depression, the Works Progress Administration responded to flooding concerns with Johnson Creek by channelizing it, lining the lower 14 miles with stone and with rock in order to A, get people to work, and B, to hopefully mitigate flooding. And as many of you learned with us last week or in previous workshops, that actually exacerbated flooding, right? Because we just didn't know how streams functioned enough. And so that channelization and that removal of wood has created again more habitat loss. And by removing trees as it affects the water, that's things, tree removal is going to cause things like warmer water temperatures, which means that our water can't hold as much oxygen. Warmer water can't hold as much dissolved oxygen as cold water can, and our cold water fish need cold, oxygen-rich water, and will also contribute to things like erosion. So this diagram talks a little bit about habitat fragmentation, and so what we're hoping to do is to link these stepping stones between those core habitat areas or patches. So the larger chunks are better. And also the less amount of edge space or edges to a habitat zone or a patch. The less edges, the better, because that's where we start to get things like encroachment from invasive species. And so a more blocky shape, like a more circular or square shape, depending on how you want to look at it, with more unedged area in the middle, that's going to sort of preserve those sections of inner habitat for our more sensitive critters. One example is, at Forest Park, along the edges, the nesting birds experience more predation, but you go further into Forest Park and you'll see, wildlife that you might see in Mount Hood, like elk and so on. So what does that look like in the North Clackamas watersheds? It can be kind of scary to make an unprotected left turn off of McLaughlin or 99 East, much less, as Neil said, to be a frog playing actual Frogger, trying to cross our streets, right? So roads are, a really main way that habitat has been, fragmented and disrupted. And then we have, things like dams themselves. So this is Kellogg Dam. It's a big barrier that the Watershed Council is working really hard to remove. The fish ladder doesn't work. We'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. And so this is, under our radar often. If you've never really gotten down towards Milwaukee Bay Park, you might not even realize that you drive over a dam regularly. And another thing that's happening under our roads are culverts. And a lot of these culverts are those, those under road pipes or tubes that our creeks pass through. Were not, designed very well for fish passage, and so have also created barriers. And then there's little things that folks might do just when, recreating in the creek. We might be creating barriers inadvertently that we don't even think about. Like folks have created these little rock dams to soak their feet in or just play in a little bit. But for a juvenile fish or for the resident fish in the system, that can absolutely, be a barrier. So either don't, that's the kind of thing that we would prefer folks to either not do or to, knock it down once they're done. So as far as restoring connectivity, this is sort of a big epic example of projects that can restore wildlife and habitat connectivity. So these wildlife crossings are a lot more common up at sort of towards Canada, and they're becoming more widespread worldwide too. This is an example of sort of big infrastructure where some of these are created that are even larger than the ones seen here and have like forests on top, and elk and grizzlies can pass over it. In our urban areas, the projects might look a little bit more like this. And so what's happened here is a culvert has been replaced in order to have better fish passage. And it's a little hard to get the scale here, but when I was at Johnson Creek Watershed Council, the before and after photo that we took, the before photo was of my super petite supervisor crouching, and she was fitting barely inside like a 3-foot diameter culvert, right? And then the one that we replaced it with was so big that the 6'5" big tall restoration projects manager spread his arms and wasn't even, taking up half the width of this culvert. So a lot of the culverts that we're replacing have been really undersized, and now we're learning that we need to provide a lot more space for those creeks to move through. And so with projects like this, you can restore the bottom of the creek with gravel and have more of a natural channel bed. And it involves, assessing things like the velocity and the incline of that section of the creek. And it's still an expensive process, with an excavator and permitting and so on, but not quite as big as like those above highway crossings. So again, another way to sort of think about habitat connectivity is in considering how do we design for people and thinking about what we can do that can either really help wildlife or not. And so these are two examples of sort of riverside trails or green spaces, right? In the bottom right, we have Tomahawk Waterfront Park. It used to be a boulevard and now it's a park, which is an improvement, for people. But still not necessarily the easiest habitat for wildlife. It's just pavement until you reach the seawall right there. And then this trail along the Tualatin River, this Tualatin River Greenway path, that's a bit more of a better example. We have more kind of riparian riverside vegetation going on, and the trail, gets a little close and a little further and sort of peeks out to viewpoints rather than being right adjacent to the creek. So there's just different ways of doing things as we learn more about what works well for our wildlife and for our people. So movement and thinking about movement corridors or creating habitat connectivity, it's a scalable situation. We can look at things at a metro region statewide scale, but we can also nail that all the way down to city or neighborhood or even your own backyard. And indeed, some of the ways to create habitat absolutely involve our yard. So for fish, fish have the whole rearing spawning process of being born in the freshwater, moving out towards the ocean, and then coming right back. So they need to traverse through our rivers in order to complete their life cycle. And, remember, steelhead do it multiple times too, right? So here's a map showing between Portland and the ocean. And we've, the navy dots right here are showing these patches, right? We're going to be looking at the Clackamas River mostly here as spawning grounds for our fish. And then we know that they make their way all the way out towards the ocean, take a right, and go out to the southern Gulf of Alaska, assuming they don't get eaten by a sea lion or an orca or so on, right? But they need to make their way then from this inland space all the way out towards the ocean. and they'll go up the Willamette Basin towards the Columbia. And so they have some pretty solid corridor space. In the way along that corridor is the Portland metro area. And remember that photo, for instance, of the Tomahawk Waterfront Park that we were just looking at? That whole Portland space isn't necessarily the most conducive space for salmon to move through. Just geologically, it's a lot straighter and a bit more simple. So it's not the easiest place to be a salmon, but we can make it happen. And that just means that our salmon need some stepping stones to make their way through this area. And once a salmon is coming back upstream to spawn, once they make it through the stepping stones, it's not just one patch that they're accessing. They're accessing lots of patches and lots more corridors, right? So let's take a closer look here at the Portland metro area, because this is how the North Clackamas watersheds really fit in to salmon migration. So the Clackamas River, puts into the Willamette at Oregon City. And then the Willamette, runs through Portland up to Osovies Island. And it's in that stretch. So here we have our patch and our corridors. So we're looking again at this section of the Willamette. This is that stretch of the Willamette where we need some of those stepping stones. And these are the North Clackamas watersheds. Oops, these are some of those stepping stones. North Clackamas watersheds, as well as Tryon and Johnson Creek. And basically, there aren't a lot of alcoves in this stretch of the Willamette. And so the salmon need a place, these juvenile salmon that are like the size of your thumb and being pushed downstream by the Willamette, making their way out towards the ocean. They need some slow, sort of softer, more gentler places, side channels to move into, to rest, and to feed and so on. And they will actually pause in these off-channel habitat areas and not stay there just for a few minutes, but actually for up to a few weeks at a time. In Tryon, the average time was about 12 days that salmon are staying in that confluence area. And again, in an urban area, there's concerns about the creeks and the water systems being too warm. And those off-channel habitat spaces are often cooler than the main stem of the Willamette. So we have little salmon nursery spots right along this stretch of the Portland region. It looks like, here's the North Clackamas map overlaid. So by providing these bits of habitat for our fish, they're able again to access a bunch more inland Oregon habitat. And this is what it looks like. So this is the mouth of Boardman Creek where it flows into the Willamette. So this is just downstream of Boardman Wetlands, which is on the other side of River Road. And so what we see here is, a river mouth that could use some more complexity. It could use some more shade, some more cover from some plantings, as well as some large wood and log jams. And Neil can speak to this a little bit more, but the Watershed Council is hoping to raise money for a project to implement that work. And it'll be a big project. It isn't only planting trees. Again, remember that diagram that showed sort of the cross section of the old growth forest with that in-stream wood. Getting those logs with those root wads, they have to be anchored into the side of the bank so that they don't drift away during high water. And so it's going to be one of those larger projects that, requires an excavator, but will ultimately start to accumulate gravel and create a more complex, sort of mirroring habitat. So these are sort of the main spaces that we're looking at when focusing for salmon. Neil, I couldn't tell if you were about to say something or not. Okay. Cool. So the Kellogg and Mount Scott subwatershed here is the largest system in the North Clackamas watersheds, and it's a pretty healthy habitat. There's a bunch of things, going on. So fall Chinook have used the lower part of the system as rearing habitat when they can get over the dam. You can only really get over the dam rarely. The fish ladder, like we said, it doesn't work. It was built in the 1930s, and the only thing that we've seen using it is a river otter sliding down it, which is, good for the river otter, but not necessarily for the fish. So there isn't a whole lot of data that the Watershed Council has, and that's one of the things that we're looking at. We don't really know how many make it above the dam and into the Mount Scott watershed, into the creek, and we don't know, how many, if any, of the smolt make their way back out. We know we have coastal cutthroat trout throughout the system, and the lamprey are probably doing something, sort of similar to coho, hanging out under the concrete of the dam. But again, at nighttime where we can't really capture any data on them as easily. So Kellogg Dam isn't just the Watershed Council's highest, priority barrier to remove, but it's also the highest priority fish passage barrier in the state of Oregon that ODOT owns. And most of you, I believe, already know this, but this was built for a flour mill that's been gone since the 1890s. It was built when Abraham Lincoln was just starting his political career, right? It's just a big, complicated, and expensive project now because there's the highway running on top of it. The bridge needs to be replaced soon too, and there's a good amount of momentum happening right now. But this is a place where we would love to see a better future confluence area for one of the creeks in our watershed. And moving out of the water a little bit and looking back at terrestrial wildlife, connectivity can be based on the river corridor, but it's potentially a lot easier to move across roads, especially if you have wings. And so there's different types of ways to create connectivity for terrestrial wildlife. And again, thinking about the patches as more of our anchor habitats or the places that the critters are trying to get to and from. These are all strategically placed because here's an aerial view of approximately the North Clackamas Watersheds area, right? This is kind of an aerial shot showing some of those main patches. So for instance, Mount Talbert, which again is, managed by Metro out near Happy Valley. Critters might want to get from there to Three Creeks natural area. And so we'd like to know a little bit more about what corridors they want to use to access those spaces. And this is where, when we start to zoom in a little bit, our backyard scale starts to become, more important. And one thing that you'll notice in different parts of, sort of metro area creeks is a lot of the corridors are sort of following right along the creek because there has been a buffer requirement for a while now. And that creek is also, solid habitat for, things like raccoons and other critters that can, maybe move through those culverts or cross those roads more safely and so on. So there's decent migration routes. And one thing that's really interesting also is that habitat connectivity doesn't follow creeks in all places. So a really good example is the Bay Area, where the stream corridors themselves are super developed, but the ridge tops are less so, and that's where the migration corridors are there. So when we're talking about scalability of passage and connectivity, it can start at the really small little scale, just individuals, a patch of, a patio of a business or something like that. And it might get to be a slightly larger place. So then we're looking at, things like gardens that might be managed by libraries or schools. And then we get to larger patches of urban habitat, like some municipalities, for instance, like the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District has their whole little small parcel of urban East Portland really decked out and really fantastic habitat. As a cool example, really vivid patch of habitat there. And then we get to our more larger urban-ish areas. And so as you move up in the size of habitat, you also, you get potentially, you get a bigger bang for your buck, but it's also going to cost more for, planning and cost and complexity's sake. But we're really, the thing is, in urban areas where we have neighborhoods and neighborhoods and neighborhoods, a lot of those stepping stones are just going to be a backyard. Hence the backyard habitat certification program, helps to really move a lot of that work forward. So if you're a white-breasted nuthatch that's dependent on oak woodland, you can only use these red dots. The places where you don't see red dots just can't support a white-breasted nuthatch. And so an oak woodland is more of a sensitive habitat. They grow more slowly. A lot have been converted to Douglas fir forests because we don't have the same fire patterns that we've had for hundreds of years in the past. So again, looking at where our key little bits of habitat are and then figuring out how to foster their health and connect them is really important for us to do. So now we want to sort of talk about what are the ways then that we can support our urban wildlife. And so we want to talk about things that we can do as individuals, things that we can do as individuals working together, and then things that we do with larger entities. So first up, for individual actions, we would posit that if your lawn looks like this, you should dress like this, because this is something that we've inherited from, Europe from hundreds of years ago that isn't really, if you're concerned about wildlife, we've just inherited this aesthetic of a bright green, vivid, flat lawn. Not only do our lawns often rely on pesticides to be the bright shade of green that we want them to be, so those pesticides, can contribute to things like runoff that lead right into our creeks. But our lawns don't really provide that same level of habitat. And so naturescaping is sort of a whole movement to really rethink landscaping with nature and urban wildlife in mind. And nature is a little messy, and that doesn't mean that you can't have a beautiful urban yard with native plants that is a little landscaped, but even just providing little patches can be really helpful. So if folks have creekside lawn spaces, again, rather than a lawn straight up to the creek, there's an opportunity to really build a whole riparian habitat here. And the backyard habitat certification program, one of the things that they suggest is to sort of think of your yard as a hallway for creatures where they need a way in and a way out. So you don't want to just only provide one space that they can access, because it might not be safe for them to leave it as well. So kind of an in and an out area, or having cover in different places for wildlife. Some of the other things then that we can do, and we'll speak to a little bit more of these bullet points in the next few slides, is simply leaving the leaves. Not only are they free mulch as they decompose, but leaves are, food and shelter for bugs. A lot of, cocoons and chrysalises can look like this one, like a leaf that we might mistake as something to just sweep into the compost bin, right? But a lot of our native insects will winter in the leaves or even just below the soil. And also so Oregon actually has, we don't know, the science is still in progress here, but Oregon has at least 500 species of bees. And most of these native bees are solitary, and a lot of them are ground or cavity nesters. And so these ground nesters, all they need is just a little patch of bare grass. So just of bare dirt, excuse me. So just leave little parts of your lawn undisturbed. That'll provide habitat for our native insects. And then also like your clippings and prunings, especially if you have any plants with little hollow stems that you're pruning, a lot of, of our insects will burrow into those stems. Providing a variety of flowers are important if you're just think about which insect could land on which flower most easily, right? So different shapes are important. One thing that we'll always plug is a lot of store-bought plants are coated in neonicotinoids, meaning the seed was tossed in this chemical. So it's going to be throughout every part of the plant, the leaves, the fruit, the flowers, the seeds, perpetually. And neonicotinoids are the cause of bees colony collapse disorder. So buying organic wherever possible is a really great way to avoid accidentally potentially making our insects disoriented. This is a resource we could send out. It's sort of a calendar that shows what blooms when and in what color it blooms in at different times of the year. Another thing you can do is think of your yard or whatever space you're stewarding. Think a bit more vertically. This map isn't specific to the Portland metro region, but it shows different birds at different canopy levels, which is a cool consideration. If you're like me and you don't have a backyard, one of the things that we can do, especially in the summertime, is to provide puddling dishes for our insects. So rather than just a bowl of water, which they might fall in and drown essentially. Providing some sand or some dirt and then just pouring a bit of water and providing a place for our bugs to rest on is really great. They're actually not just drinking the water, they're getting the minerals in the dirt there too. And this is, when we're talking about plants, we're really going to lean on encouraging folks to use native plants. Habitat fragmentation isn't only from concrete, but it's from a lack of the plants that our wildlife need. And the way that I like to really make that connection is a lot of us are familiar with monarch butterflies. They can only propagate on milkweed. It's a super direct and important relationship. If there isn't milkweed, there can't be monarch butterflies. Well, over 90% of herbivorous insects are specialists, which means that they too will only eat one or a few native plants. So not quite monarch and milkweed with the 1-to-1, but over 90% will only eat one or a few of these native plants that they've co-evolved with, right? And 96% of terrestrial birds, so meaning not ocean birds, so 96% of terrestrial birds feed their young on insects, regardless of what those birds eat when they're adults, whether it's seeds or fruit or insects or smaller birds even maybe, right? The caterpillars and so on are a really high protein source. And so even one patch of ivy that's 10 foot by 10 foot being replaced by a few native shrubs is already going to provide a lot of important habitat. And ornamentals are often attractive to people because we see less pests on them, but a lot of what we perceive as pests are actually critical food resources for our insects, which echoes right up directly to our backyard birds. Another thing we can do, fellow cat people in the room, I know Neil's with me on this train of loving our cats. They are basically the leading source of birds that are being brought into Audubon's Care Center, more so than cars and window collisions. And cat's impact is pretty substantial. So essentially, only take your cat out on a harness if you're going to let it outside at all, or you can look up Audubon's catio tour. You don't necessarily need to do the tour itself, but catios are a great way to give your cat that outdoor enrichment without letting them predate on birds. Another thing is snags. So standing dead trees are the apartment complexes and cafeterias of our urban ecosystem. Woodpeckers don't reuse the same cavity they build each year, and lots of our other critters are cavity nesters. You remember the kestrel that we saw earlier in the presentation. So one thing is, if you have a tree with some limbs leaning over your garage or something, for instance, you could consider working not to remove the whole tree entirely, but just to shorten it or cut it down and leave that snag, that dead wood, to provide a really important part of a really important habitat and resources for our wildlife. If you were with us last week again, we talked about non-point solution and the fact that a lot of stormwater pollutants come from things that we can't isolate as one pipe coming out of one factory. And it's from just all of the little different things that can be picked up along the way by rain, whether it's, again, our fertilizers on our bright, shiny green lawns, or our leaky motorcycle that we forgot to put our cardboard under when we're working on, something like that. And so finding ways to reduce our own impacts, taking your car to a commercial car wash is better because they'll recycle the water and use less of it. And this kind of harks back to that finding about the car tires and coho, the PPD quinone. Again, we're trying to figure out ways to reduce that stormwater runoff and the pollution that goes in there. Rain gardens can do a bunch of different things. By creating a little bit of a bowl and planting native plants and disconnecting your downspout and directing your water into this garden space, you're slowing down the water, you're filtering it, it's providing habitat and even aesthetically pleasing, really. So we would love for you all to go ahead and explore some of the places in the North Clackamas Watersheds, especially since you've put yourself through sitting inside on a beautiful evening. Go ahead and get outside tomorrow, right? Or this weekend or sometime. And hopefully you can take a look at some of these places. We can send this out too as well. I would be remiss to not say that Elk Rock Island had a fire in September and only just opened and is still dealing with a lot of overuse already. So just be nice and delicate and gentle to poor Elk Rock Island. But go ahead and explore a bunch of these places that are in the watersheds for us. And these are things, again, so we're still talking about things that we can do individually. Learning and collecting data and just getting out there is fantastic. We need data. Like we mentioned, there's a lack of data in some of these urban watersheds. It was my old supervisor was cleaning out her backyard and moving like an old cornhole plywood thing and found an Oregon slender salamander. And before that, we thought that they were only like up towards Mount Hood and the gorge. And here it was right in Portland city limits. So a lot of it is just a matter of finding and sharing the data that's out there. And that kind of stuff, happens regularly because we just don't have the budget or resources to get that info. Which leads us to things that we can do together. And so particularly what the Watershed Council is doing. Again, we're a small nonprofit based out of Milwaukee. We do on the ground restoration, both small and large. So planting trees on little parcels, also trying to get those large wood projects like at that, at the Boardman confluence and so on. We're continuing to work to remove Kellogg Dam, getting more, getting more science collected about our watersheds. We're flying drones over parts of the watershed to get a better shade analysis. And we're talking to you by engaging you because we can't do it all ourselves. And we hope that you can carry some of these things forward and help, support our urban wildlife. So this is just an example of that few-year process of the Streamside Stewards program. Volunteer events are kind of picking up again as we move towards springtime. When I mentioned that we were, upping our science game, this is that rapid bioassessment report. And again, that flying the drone to figure out not just where the shade is, but how high are those trees. We can measure a bunch of really interesting things that will tell us where to focus our efforts in the coming years. So that bioassessment, I identified 39 projects for the Watershed Council to take on, some large wood, big ones, some small science ones. Again, we're working on channel design for the Kellogg Dam removal to see what that might look like once it's removed. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock here, so I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly. One thing that the Watersheds Council is doing consistently is weighing into public processes. I'm going to click through this because we're going to show you something very similar in a moment. But we wanted to talk also about, again, this watershed level planning, things that need to happen with those larger entities, because we know that more people are moving to the watersheds. And there are good ways and bad ways to build houses and, account for increasing populations. Again, so these two, have about the same number of houses, but one of these is incorporating bioswales and stormwater filtration and has, if you were a squirrel, which one would you be safer in, right? Which, where do you see more shrubs with more insects if you were a bird, so on and so forth. As well as for people, one really interesting thing, if you'll join us next week for the People in Place workshop, is having a better urban canopy, having more trees actually reduces the speed of traffic and reduces like road rage incidences and things like that. So even just creating more tree lined streets and things like that. So these are the kind of things that are, up to us and our local government. And as I said, the Watershed Council is already at the table, providing a recommendation and a viewpoint, and that's where your voice really comes in and your voice really matters. Our voice is already a part of the conversation, but really, we would encourage you all to get involved. And one key thing that's happening right now is the comprehensive plan implementation. This closes in just a couple of days, but it's a really cool online, easy open house at just engage.milwaukeeoregon.gov. Where you can weigh in on the code development that's taking into account not just housing, but also parking and trees, so our urban canopy. Keep an eye out for some work from Wes from Water Environment Services for planning around the Three Creeks project. Again, that was one of the anchor habitat bigger patches that we were looking at. They'll be figuring out how to reduce downstream flooding for folks and increase habitat and fish passage opportunities in the process, as well as possibly increasing public access. It's one of those places that would be a really great place to bring school groups and build more, in nature experiences for our youth here. Overall, there just isn't enough money spent on we don't spend nearly enough money on what it takes to study and to restore urban wildlife. Kellogg Dam isn't still there because ODOT doesn't want to remove it. They would be just as glad as the rest of us to have it out, but they don't have the money in their fish passage budget to do it, right? A lot of money in wildlife related budget goes to game animals like deer and ducks and fish, not so much for the woodpeckers and the muskrats and the kestrels, right? And some of that funding is connected to hunting and fishing licenses, but weighing in, on budget processes just to see how things are shaping up is another great way to be involved. And really, when we fix problems for wildlife, we fix problems for us too, right? Wildlife likes to be in the same kind of places where we like to be. That's why we have our trails near creeks and rivers in the first place, because we enjoy being, around and immersed in nature. The Boardman Wetlands Project is a really great example of that. So a couple success stories, and then we'd love to hear from you what some of your ideas are for what you might want to do to get involved as far as promoting our urban habitat and wildlife. So this was a 2017 project in Rainerson, where a small dam came out to create rearing habitat, and during construction they found 500 juvenile Chinook. They had to remove them from the work area. So we know that if the habitat is there, it will be used. And again, the Boardman Wetlands Project, we'll send out a link to this little video we put together. It's near it's near Southeast Addy Street, just right off of McLaughlin. And not only does it have this cool pathway, but it also has like a nature play area and playground, kind of an outdoor classroom setting, and is a really cool place to visit. And this, restored a historic wetland, and is providing right next to McLaughlin a lot of filtration and so on. West removed a dam at 122nd and Mount Scott Creek. So there's a lot of work that can be done to restore, our habitat patches for our urban wildlife. And if you want a sense that we can restore wildlife to urban areas, bald eagles are a great example. Neil took this photo right out of the office window at Milwaukee Presbyterian Church, right? Bald eagles were, super declining, and now they're thriving, and that can happen, with other species too. So what we would love to hear from you all first is what bird this is. And then we'd love to hear either on audio or in the chat, what are some of the things here that sort of piqued your interest as far as things that you might be able to do day-to-day life, daily habit, or in the space you live to help wildlife, and maybe some of the larger issues that we talked about, whether it's the comprehensive plan or community science, things like that you're interested in. So first, what bird is this? It can go in chat or on audio. You got it. It's a towhee. All right. I'll just leave this up for a moment as a reminder that next week's workshop is a really cool one where we're talking more about the interconnectedness between human health, watershed health, wildlife health, and trees especially. So I hope you guys can join us next week too. But yeah, I think that brings me to ending screen share and getting to hear from you all. With 3 minutes to spare, no less.
So there were two questions in the chat, and I'm going to address them very quickly. The first one was just was about the amount of jump there or elevation becomes a barrier to juvenile salmon. The short answer is it depends. The slightly longer answer is the things that it depends on are which kind of juvenile salmon it is. Steelhead, for instance, are the strongest swimmers. Coho are pretty whippy, that sort of thing. What matters in addition just to the height that they can jump is the velocity of the water that's coming down it. And if there are any features that can make it easier for them to basically get a running start or a swimming start. So like a pool right below the jump will allow them to jump higher. When you basically look at a culvert, there's basically a set of equations that fish biologists use to do a little bit of kind of fairly back of the envelope hydraulic modeling to assess those features and basically say, is this a barrier? Is it not? You usually do that with a look at both that low water, basically when the jump is going to be the highest. But that is a whole kind of field in itself, is just kind of figuring that out. So I don't know how to do that myself. That's what, that's the kind of the realm of fish biologists. But generally speaking, what I've been told is like those barriers that people build in Kellogg Creek to create a little pool for their kids to splash around in, they're definitely not remotely a barrier to any sort of adult fish. But could a juvenile trout get through them? Maybe not. That's the short answer to that. The other question was about the wildfires and removing vegetation around your house and building. And obviously that's on everybody's mind after this past horrific fire season that we had. And that's obviously important for both us and our safety and our property, but also for maintaining the plants that are already there. The quick answer to that is not my area of expertise when it comes to things like fire behavior. The folks that I tend to direct people to are to things like a woman named Jenny Reishi at Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District. But they're kind of much more versed in that. I will say that obviously one of the reasons why Elk Rock Island did so well in the fire is that there were a lot of kind of drought and fire resistant plants there to begin with, things like oak and madrone. So it didn't necessarily become the big conflagration that people have feared.
They've also done controlled burning in the past at Elk Rock Island.
Oh, but yes, there are definitely ways to kind of marry the combination of defensible space around buildings as far as fire with habitat. You've got one of the folks that we work with doing that up in Happy Valley now. And I sent folks to the Soil and Water Conservation District for the actual kind of assistance on how to do that. Those are the questions that were in the Zoom.
I've got one. So I live along Kellogg Creek and lost 2 trees in the ice storm and wanted to plant something to replace them, given that one of them in particular was a big contributor to shade in that part of the creek. So I'm looking at a list of native trees and it's a little overwhelming because we would love something that grows quickly, would love something that, is going to be tolerant of being fairly close to the water because we don't have a lot of good space to deal with. And so I was looking for a recommendation in terms of what we should buy to plant.
I think the short answer to this, and I'll pass it over to Alexis, is I probably would want to know a little bit more and maybe talk offline about kind of how much sun you're getting in that spot and kind of what was there in the past that was doing well, because a lot of that is probably going to be a factor. Obviously things like willows and cottonwoods and alder that tend to grow really well near water and really quickly kind of can form an intermediate stage, and then something else can grow after them. But I would say it depends on the site, and either you or Lauren or Alexis and I can kind of help you do that.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was gonna say too, Neil. Getting something a little bit quicker and a little bit slower to meet that short term and long term. The things that grow faster, like alders, for instance, might only live 60, 80 years, as opposed to something that's gonna live for hundreds, but take longer to get there. So yeah, it might make sense for us to connect with you offline, Kat, and connect you to Lauren, I think, Neil.
And the other common question I get, we had a lot of this over the last couple of months, is people saying, hey, this tree fell in the creek during the ice storm. What should I do? And my usual answer is I would frankly just crack open a beer and relax. We want more wood in the creek. You know, we're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to put large wood in the creeks in places. So if it falls in and of its own, it's great to replant, but leave that down wood. It's really valuable habitat.
Totally. Always sharing the snag love.
Other question? All right.
So actually, Neil,
Oh yeah.
you said you were going to post this. Are you going to post it on the North Clackamas Watershed website? Or?
Yes. Yeah. I will probably. It might take me a little bit of time to remember how to do that. But yeah, we will.
And Sue, as a backup, I'm not sure how easy it'll be to work with WordPress to get it on the website, but if anything, we'll be able to link it to Google Drive to watch it there.
Okay, that'd be great.
Great.
All right, thanks, guys. Good job.
Thank you, Sue.
Neil, do we have a map of the Boardman watershed specifically?
I'll
Asking.
take a look. I know we have. Let's see. I know we have it. I might have to kind of jockey to turn into like a PDF, but I know we have it in some other fancy GIS format, as well as just, I mean, you know, it's zoom in on the creating stuff on that map. We'll get it to you somehow. For sure.
Yeah, we'll get it to you, Gary.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks. Think you could catch your photo earlier shot?
Who are you talking to?
Oh, it's Dr. Dick, but I think.
Oh, I think you spoke up right as he exited.
Yeah.
That was, you did a great job.
He had a hard time getting on, so I was trying.